Nathan Calloway had finished 3 men who tried to cross him, and yet nothing scared him more than the piece of paper sitting on his desk. It was his grandfather's will, and it had one final condition attached to it. Marry within the year, stay married for 12 months, or lose control of every legitimate business the Calloway family had spent 3 generations building. The casinos, the hotels, the shipping lines, all of it would pass into the hands of a board of strangers if Nathan didn't find a wife by his 28th birthday. He had 2 weeks left. "You understand this isn't a suggestion," his attorney Marcus Webb said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Judge Callahan wrote that clause knowing exactly what he was doing. He wanted you settled before you inherited real power." Nathan didn't answer. He stared out the window of his Chicago penthouse at the skyline his family had quietly owned pieces of for decades. Everyone in this city knew his name. Everyone feared it. 3 separate matchmaking services had already dropped him as a client after their clients backed out mid-introduction. One woman had taken one look at the security detail outside the restaurant and left through the kitchen. "There's no one left to ask," Nathan said flatly. "Every family in this city has heard the rumors." Marcus hesitated, then opened a second folder. "There's one option you haven't considered. It's unconventional." "I'm listening." "A contract marriage, not arranged through the usual circles, through an agency that matches people looking for exactly that. No feelings involved, no family politics. She signs, she moves in, she stays for the year, and then it's over. Clean." Nathan almost laughed. "You want me to marry a stranger?" "I want you to keep your company." 3 days later, Nathan sat across from a woman named Evelyn Harper in a coffee shop 2 blocks from his office, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't know what to say. She wasn't what he expected. Not polished, not nervous, not calculating. She had warm brown eyes, a soft round face that broke easily into a smile, and she talked with her hands like she'd forgotten anyone was watching. She wore a cardigan with a coffee stain on the sleeve and didn't seem to care. "So," Evelyn said, wrapping both hands around her mug, "you're the Mafia guy." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "That's usually the part people whisper about instead of saying out loud." "I don't really do whispering," she shrugged. "My grandmother raised me to just ask the question. She passed 8 months ago. I was her caretaker for 6 years before that, and now I've got a stack of medical bills, a degree in library science nobody's hiring for, and a lease I can't afford past next month." She said it plainly, without asking for sympathy, and something about that honesty caught Nathan off guard. "The agency explained the terms?" he asked. 1 year. I live at your estate, we're seen together when it matters, and I get a settlement at the end that clears my debt twice over. No expectations beyond that. We stay out of each other's way." She tilted her head. "Did I miss anything?" "No," Nathan said. "That's the arrangement." "Then I have one condition of my own." He hadn't expected that. Nobody in his world negotiated with him. They either agreed or they left. "Go on." "I don't want to be treated like staff, and I don't want to be treated like a secret. If people ask, I'm your wife, not some arrangement you're ashamed of. I'll play the part in public, but at home, I want to be a person, not a piece of paper you signed." Nathan studied her for a long moment. He'd expected a business transaction, a woman who wanted the money and nothing else. Instead, she was asking him to treat her with basic respect, as though that should be obvious, as though most people in his life hadn't spent years treating him like a threat first and a man second. "Agreed," he said. They were married 11 days later at the county courthouse with Marcus and Evelyn's college roommate as the only witnesses. Evelyn wore a simple ivory dress she'd bought off a clearance rack, and Nathan wore his usual dark suit, and the judge who married them clearly had no idea he was standing between a Mafia boss and a librarian from Portland who'd answered a classified ad out of desperation. There was no music, no flowers, no first dance. When the judge pronounced them married, Nathan turned to Evelyn, expecting an awkward handshake, and instead she smiled at him. A real smile, easy and unguarded, and said, "Well, Mr. Calloway, try not to be too intimidating at breakfast." He almost smiled back. He wasn't sure the last time that had happened without effort. That same afternoon, a black car pulled through the iron gates of the Calloway estate, and Evelyn stepped out holding 2 suitcases and a cardboard box of her grandmother's old photographs. She stood on the gravel driveway, staring up at a house bigger than the library she used to work in, and Nathan watched her from the front steps, waiting to see if she'd change her mind now that the reality of it was in front of her. She didn't flinch. She just took a breath, looked at him, and said, "Well, guess this is home for a year." Nathan had no idea, standing there in the late afternoon light, that the woman his lawyer had found through a stranger's agency was about to become the only person in his life who had never once been afraid of him. The estate had 11 bedrooms, a staff of 14, and a silence that Evelyn wasn't used to. She woke up on her first full morning as Mrs. Calloway to sunlight pouring through curtains someone had already opened for her, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then she remembered the courthouse, the ivory dress on clearance, and the man who now technically shared her last name but hadn't said more than a dozen words to her since she'd arrived. Nathan was gone before she came downstairs. A housekeeper named Renata told her he left for the office most mornings before 7 and rarely returned before dark. "Does he always work that much?" Evelyn asked, sitting at the enormous kitchen island because the dining room felt too formal for breakfast alone. Renata gave her a careful look, the kind people gave when they weren't sure how much they were allowed to say. "Mr. Calloway doesn't know how to do anything halfway." That became the pattern of the first week. Nathan handled meetings, phone calls, and whatever business a man in his position handled behind closed doors, while Evelyn wandered a house that felt more like a hotel than a home. Nobody made eye contact with her for long. Nobody used her first name unless she asked them to, twice. So she started asking. By Wednesday, she knew that Renata had 2 grandchildren she never talked about because it made her miss them. By Thursday, she'd learned the groundskeeper, an older man named Otis, had worked for the Calloway family for over 20 years and used to garden for Nathan's grandfather. By Friday, she knew the names of all 6 kitchen staff, and she'd figured out that the youngest one, a 19-year-old named Priya, was putting herself through culinary school on the side and never got a chance to cook anything creative because the household ran on strict, simple meals approved months in advance. "Why don't you make something you'd actually want to make?" Evelyn asked her one afternoon, leaning against the counter while Priya chopped vegetables for another plain dinner. Priya laughed like the question didn't make sense. "Mr. Calloway doesn't really do requests. We keep it simple, predictable. Nobody complains that way." "I'd complain if I had to eat the same 5 meals for a year," Evelyn said, only half joking. That night, after watching the kitchen staff work a double shift preparing food for a business dinner Nathan hosted at the last minute, Evelyn found herself standing in front of the stove at 10 at night, the house finally quiet, everyone else already gone to bed or gone home. She hadn't cooked for anyone but her grandmother in years. It felt strange, pulling out a pan in a kitchen that wasn't hers, using ingredients she hadn't paid for. But her hands remembered the motions anyway. Dicing onions, browning garlic, the smell of something simmering that had nothing to do with impressing anyone. She made a pot of her grandmother's chicken and dumplings, the recipe scrawled on an index card she still carried in her wallet, and left a note on the counter for the staff explaining there'd be leftovers if anyone wanted breakfast. Nathan came home near midnight, later than usual, and found the kitchen lights still on and Evelyn asleep at the island, with her head resting on her arms, a cookbook open in front of her that she must have pulled just to have something to read while it simmered. He stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure what to do with the sight of it. Nobody cooked in this house who didn't work for him. Nobody stayed up past midnight in his kitchen unless something had gone wrong. He gently said her name, and she startled awake, blinking up at him with the kind of confusion that came from waking somewhere unfamiliar. "Sorry," she mumbled, sitting up straighter. "I made too much food, and then I got tired waiting for it to cool down enough to store." Nathan glanced at the pot on the stove. "You cooked." "The kitchen staff worked 12 hours today because of your dinner meeting. I figured they could use one night where somebody made food for them instead of the other way around." She shrugged like it was obvious. "There's plenty left if you're hungry." He hadn't eaten since noon. He also hadn't had a home-cooked meal in longer than he wanted to admit. Every meal in this house arrived from a private chef's rotation, plated and portioned, technically food, but never quite a meal. He sat down across from her at the island, and she served him a bowl without asking if he wanted one, and for the first time since the wedding, Nathan Calloway ate dinner across from another person instead of alone at the head of a table built for 12. "This is good," he said, and meant it. "It's my grandmother's recipe. She used to say a full house should smell like something's cooking, or it's not really a home." Evelyn watched him eat for a moment. "This place doesn't smell like anything. It's beautiful, but it's cold." Nathan didn't respond right away. He'd grown up in this house, inherited its silence along with its name, and had never once thought to question why it always felt the way it did. "My grandfather ran this house like he ran his business," he said finally. "Efficient, controlled, nothing out of place." "Sounds lonely." It was. Something shifted in the way he said it, and Evelyn didn't push further, but she filed it away. The first honest thing he'd told her since they'd met. Over the following days, without either of them announcing it, the house began to change in small ways. Evelyn learned Renata's grandchildren's names and asked about them by name. She convinced Priya to try a new recipe for the staff's own dinner, one Priya had wanted to make for months. She started eating breakfast in the kitchen instead of the dining room, and slowly, one by one, the staff started eating theirs at the same table instead of standing at the counter to finish quickly. Nathan noticed it before he understood it. He noticed Otis laughing outside near the garden shed, something he hadn't heard from the man in years. He noticed the kitchen staff talking more freely when he passed through, no longer going quiet the moment he entered a room. He said nothing about it out loud, but every evening he came home a little less braced for silence and a little more curious about what he might find instead. The marriage was still a contract. The year was still a countdown. But the house, for the first time in a long time, had started to breathe. 3 weeks into the marriage, Nathan told Evelyn to pack a bag for the weekend. "Business," he said, not looking up from his phone. "One of our hotels on Lake Geneva needs a walkthrough before we finalize a renovation contract. It'll look better if my wife is with me." Evelyn raised an eyebrow at the word wife, still unused to hearing it applied to herself. "So I'm coming along to stand next to you and look married?" "Essentially." "Romantic," she said dryly, and for the first time she saw the corner of his mouth twitch like he almost wanted to smile. The drive to Wisconsin took just under 2 hours, most of it quiet except for the radio playing low. Evelyn watched the city give way to open fields and then, eventually, water. A long blue stretch of lake with small towns tucked along its edge, docks lined with boats, and none of the tension that clung to every street in Chicago. The hotel itself was smaller than Nathan's usual properties, an old lakeside building with wraparound porches and a history that predated most of the city blocks he owned downtown. He walked the halls with a contractor for 2 hours while Evelyn wandered the grounds, and by the time he found her again, she was sitting on the porch steps with an ice cream cone from a shop down the road, talking to an elderly guest about the best walking paths around the lake. "You made a friend," Nathan said. "Her name's Dorothy. She's been coming here every summer since 1974. Evelyn handed him the second cone she'd bought, without asking if he wanted one. "Here, you look like you need sugar more than another business conversation." He took it, mostly out of surprise, and ate lakeside ice cream standing next to a woman he'd married 11 days after meeting her, wondering when exactly this had started to feel less like an arrangement and more like an afternoon. They stayed 2 extra days. Nathan told himself it was because the contractor needed more time, but the truth was closer to the fact that neither of them wanted to rush back to the silence of the estate. They fell into an easy rhythm neither had planned. Mornings they walked the path around the lake before the town woke up fully, past docks and boathouses and a lighthouse that hadn't worked in decades. Afternoons, they found small cafes with mismatched chairs and terrible coffee, and somehow ended up talking for hours anyway. "You grew up here?" Evelyn asked on the second morning, watching a family load a boat with fishing gear. "No, Chicago mostly. My grandfather brought me here a few times when I was small, before things got complicated." Nathan kept his eyes on the water. "It's one of the only places that doesn't remind me of the business." "What was he like, your grandfather?" Nathan was quiet long enough that Evelyn thought he might not answer. "Demanding, smart. He built everything my family has, but he never let anyone forget what it cost him to build it. I spent most of my childhood trying to prove I could carry that weight the same way he did." "Did it work? Proving it?" "I don't know anymore." He glanced at her. "Nobody's ever asked me that question directly before." "I ask a lot of direct questions. My grandmother used to say I never learned the art of small talk." Evelyn smiled, but it faded into something more thoughtful. "For what it's worth, you don't act the way people describe you. Everyone in Chicago talks like you're something to be afraid of." "Most people are afraid of me." He said it plainly, without pride or shame, like a fact he'd made peace with a long time ago. "It's easier that way. People don't ask questions when they're afraid. They just do what they're told." "I'm not afraid of you." "I've noticed." "Does that bother you?" Nathan considered the question longer than she expected. "No. It's the first time in years someone's looked at me and not flinched. I didn't realize how much I'd missed that until you didn't do it." They kept walking, the conversation settling into something quieter, more honest than either had intended when the weekend started. That evening, they ate dinner on the hotel's back porch overlooking the water, and Evelyn told him about her grandmother, how she'd raised Evelyn after her parents split when she was young, how the 6 years of caretaking at the end had drained every account she had, but she'd never once regretted staying. "People think I married you out of desperation," she said, turning her water glass slowly on the table. "And maybe part of it was. I needed the money, I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I also wanted a chance to start over somewhere nobody already had an opinion about me." "And now? Do they have opinions?" "Now they think I'm either very brave or very foolish for marrying the scariest man in Chicago." She laughed softly. "I've decided I don't mind either version." Nathan watched the sun drop lower over the lake, painting the water orange, and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not the tight, guarded feeling he carried through every business meeting, but something looser, something that almost resembled peace. "I used to think people would only ever see the name Calloway and nothing else," he said. "You're the first person who's talked to me like there's a difference." "There is a difference," Evelyn said simply. "I just don't think anyone's bothered to look for it before." Neither of them said anything else for a long moment. The lake grew quiet except for the sound of water against the dock, and for the first time since the courthouse, the silence between them didn't feel empty. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them had agreed to in writing. By the time they packed the car for Chicago 2 days later, Nathan found himself dreading the return to the estate's usual routine, and Evelyn caught herself hoping there'd be another reason for a trip like this one soon. Neither said it out loud, but something had shifted at that lake, quietly and without warning, and there was no contract in the world that could undo what had already started to grow between them. By the time they returned from Lake Geneva, something about the two of them had changed, and Chicago noticed before either of them fully admitted it to themselves. Nathan started bringing Evelyn to more than just the obligatory events. What began as a single business dinner turned into a pattern, a charity gala, a dinner with 2 shipping partners from Detroit, a Sunday brunch with the mayor's office that Nathan usually attended alone. Evelyn learned fast. She remembered names, asked thoughtful questions, and never once flinched when someone mentioned Nathan's reputation within earshot, as if daring her to react. She never did. "You're good at this," Nathan told her after the gala, helping her into the car. I spent years working the reference desk at a library where half the patrons wanted to fight about late fees. Rich people making small talk is easy by comparison. She kicked off her heels the moment the door closed. Though I could do without the heels. He almost laughed. It kept happening more often lately. Small moments where his guard slipped without him deciding to let it. But not everyone found the change charming. Two of Nathan's longtime associates, men who'd worked alongside his grandfather decades earlier, began asking pointed questions at every gathering. Frank Delgado, an old business partner who controlled several of the city's shipping contracts, cornered Nathan at a dinner in early spring. "Word is your wife's got you soft," Frank said, swirling his drink. "Skipping meetings, turning down deals you'd have jumped on a year ago. People are noticing, Nathan. People who used to be scared of you." "I'm not skipping anything," Nathan said flatly. "I'm choosing what deserves my time." "That's a nice way of saying she's got you distracted." Nathan didn't respond to that, but the comment sat with him longer than he wanted to admit. He'd turned down an aggressive deal the week before, one his grandfather would have taken without hesitation, one that would have hurt a small trucking company just trying to stay afloat. He told himself it was good business sense. Frank clearly saw it differently. The rumors didn't stay confined to boardrooms. At the estate, staff members who once kept their conversations carefully guarded around Nathan had grown comfortable enough to talk more freely, not realizing how far their voices carried through the halls. Evelyn heard two of the housekeepers talking near the kitchen one afternoon, unaware she was standing just around the corner. "He's different since she got here," one of them said. "Smiles more, comes home earlier. I heard him laughing on the phone yesterday. Actually laughing, not that fake business laugh he does for clients." "You think it's real between them? The marriage?" "I don't know, but something's real. Nobody fakes that kind of mood shift." Evelyn stepped away before they noticed her, her chest tight with something she didn't have a name for. She'd known the marriage was supposed to stay simple, a business arrangement dressed up as a wedding, an expiration date built into the paperwork from the start. But standing in that hallway, hearing strangers describe changes in Nathan that she'd caused without meaning to, she felt the careful distance she'd promised herself starting to crack. That night at dinner, she found herself watching Nathan more closely than usual. The way he loosened his tie the moment he sat down, the way he actually asked about her day instead of only discussing logistics. The quiet ease that had replaced the stiffness of their first weeks together. "You're staring," Nathan said, not looking up from his plate. "Sorry, thinking." Evelyn set down her fork. "People are talking about us. At your gala, at the estate, everyone thinks something real is happening." Nathan went still for a moment. "Does that bother you?" "I don't know what bothers me anymore," she admitted. "I signed up for a business deal. I told myself that's all this would ever be, but it doesn't feel like a business deal most days, and I don't know what to do with that." He set down his own fork, meeting her eyes directly for the first time that evening. "I've been telling myself the same thing, that there's a date on the calendar and none of this is supposed to matter past it." "Has it worked? Telling yourself that?" "No," he said quietly. "Not lately." The admission hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them expected. For a moment, Evelyn thought he might say something more, reach across the table, close the distance that had been quietly shrinking for weeks. Instead, his phone buzzed with a message from Marcus about an emergency meeting, and the moment folded shut as quickly as it had opened. Nathan excused himself, and Evelyn sat alone at the table, staring at the food going cold in front of her, wondering if she'd imagined the whole exchange. Later that night, Nathan stood on the balcony outside his office, phone forgotten in his pocket, staring out at the same skyline he'd been staring at since he was a boy, learning what it meant to inherit fear instead of comfort. Frank's warning echoed in his head, alongside the housekeeper's comment Evelyn had repeated to him, alongside the quiet ache he felt every time Evelyn left a room before he was ready for her to. He reminded himself, the way he had every night for the past week, that the contract had a clear end date, 12 months, no renewals implied, no feelings required. It was supposed to be simple. But simple had stopped describing anything about his life since the day Evelyn Harper walked into that coffee shop wearing a stained cardigan and asked him blunt questions nobody else dared to ask. He didn't know yet whether that frightened him or steadied him. Possibly both. What he did know, standing alone on that balcony while the city lights blinked below him, was that pretending the contract could contain what was growing between them had become a harder lie to tell with every week that passed. His trip to Nashville was supposed to be simple. Nathan needed to negotiate the purchase of a historic hotel from an old acquaintance of his grandfather's, a stubborn man named Walt Pierce, who refused to discuss business over the phone or through lawyers. He wanted to meet Nathan in person, and he wanted to meet the wife everyone in Chicago had started talking about.
"We could fly," Evelyn said, looking at the map on Nathan's desk. "It's what, an 8-hour drive?"
"Closer to 9, Nathan closed his laptop. "But my pilot's grounded until Thursday for maintenance, and Walt wants to meet in 2 days. We'll drive." Evelyn hadn't expected to enjoy it. 9 hours in a car with a man she still hadn't fully figured out sounded exhausting on paper. But somewhere around hour 2, after they'd argued cheerfully about the radio and settled on a classic rock station neither of them would admit to actually liking, something in the car loosened. "You're telling me you've never seen this movie?" Nathan said, incredulous, after Evelyn mentioned she'd missed an entire decade of popular films while caring for her grandmother. "I was busy managing prescriptions and hospital bills. Forgive me for missing whatever cultural moment you're referencing." "It's a classic. Everyone's seen it." "Well, now you have a mission. Add it to the list of things you're apparently determined to educate me on." She smiled out the window at the passing fields. "You've got a whole list going now. Movies, music, apparently my terrible taste in gas station snacks." "Your taste in gas station snacks is genuinely alarming." "Cheese puffs are a valid road trip choice." "They're orange dust with a personality disorder." She laughed so hard she nearly choked on the cheese puff in question, and Nathan found himself grinning at the sound of it. Something easy and unguarded that had nothing to do with business or reputation or any of the things that usually occupied his mind on long drives. They stopped at a roadside diner outside Louisville for lunch, a place with cracked vinyl booths and a waitress who called everyone honey, regardless of age. Nathan ordered a plate of eggs and bacon he clearly hadn't eaten in years, the kind of food too simple for the private chef back home to ever consider making, and Evelyn watched him enjoy it like it was the best meal he'd had in months. "When's the last time you ate somewhere like this?" she asked. Nathan thought about it seriously. "I honestly don't remember. Maybe when I was small, before my grandfather decided diners weren't appropriate for someone who'd eventually run the family business. That's sad." "It didn't feel sad at the time. It felt normal." He shrugged. "You don't miss what you don't know you're missing." "Well, now you know. Consider this diner officially added to your re-education list, right next to the movies." The waitress, overhearing part of the conversation while refilling their coffee, glanced between them with a knowing smile. "You two be married long? You've got that comfortable thing going. Took my husband and me a decade to bicker like that without it turning into a real fight." Evelyn opened her mouth to correct her, to explain the truth of the arrangement, and found she didn't actually want to. "Not that long," she said instead, glancing at Nathan. "Feels longer, in a good way." Nathan didn't correct the waitress either. He just reached across the table and, without entirely deciding to, took Evelyn's hand for a moment before letting it go, an instinct rather than a performance, and neither of them mentioned it again for the rest of the meal. By the time they crossed into Tennessee, the conversation had drifted somewhere neither of them had planned. Evelyn told him about the year she'd tried to become a chef before switching to library science, how she'd burned an entire Thanksgiving dinner so badly the smoke alarm brought 2 of her neighbors running. Nathan told her about the one summer he'd tried to escape the family business entirely, working construction under a fake name for 3 months before his grandfather tracked him down and reminded him exactly what he was born into. "Did you ever think about just leaving?" Evelyn asked quietly. "Walking away from all of it?" "Every day, for a while." Nathan kept his eyes on the road. "But it's not just a business. It's people who depend on it. Employees, their families, entire supply chains built around decisions my grandfather made 40 years ago. Walking away doesn't just free me. It leaves a lot of people stranded. That's a heavy thing to carry alone. I've had practice. You don't have to anymore, she said before she could stop herself, and the words sat between them, unplanned and honest, filling the car with a silence that felt different from every other quiet stretch of the drive. Nathan glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression, but he didn't argue the point, and he didn't change the subject either. They reached Nashville that evening, checked into a small hotel near downtown, and by the time they walked to dinner along streets filled with live music spilling out of every bar, strangers on the sidewalk assumed without hesitation that they were a couple who'd been together for years. A man selling flowers outside a restaurant handed Evelyn a single rose and told Nathan he was lucky to have a woman who looked at him the way she did. Neither of them corrected him. Walking back to the hotel that night, hands brushing occasionally without either pulling away, Evelyn realized she'd stopped counting the days left on the contract somewhere around hour 4 of the drive. Nathan realized, watching her hum along to a song drifting out of an open bar door, that he no longer thought of this trip as an inconvenient negotiation he'd been forced to bring her along for. It had become something else entirely, quietly, and without either of them signing anything to make it official. By the time they fell asleep that night in separate rooms down the same hallway, the 9-hour drive back to Chicago felt less like a return to normal and more like a countdown to something neither of them was ready to name yet. The invitation to the Denver conference arrived 2 weeks after Nashville, and Nathan almost declined it. It was an annual gathering of investors and business owners from across the Midwest, a weekend of panels and closed-door meetings dressed up as networking. The kind of event where reputations were built or quietly dismantled over expensive dinners. Frank Delgado would be there. So would half a dozen men who'd spent the last month whispering about how marriage had softened Nathan Calloway. You don't have to come, Nathan told Evelyn, watching her pack anyway. It's going to be a room full of people looking for a reason to underestimate both of us. Then it's a good thing I've had practice being underestimated my whole life. She zipped her suitcase closed. Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't spend the entire weekend scowling at people over cocktail shrimp. The conference hotel in Denver sat against a backdrop of mountains still capped with late snow, and from the moment they walked into the opening reception, Evelyn felt the shift in the room. Conversations pausing slightly, eyes tracking their entrance, the particular kind of attention reserved for people others had already formed opinions about. Frank found them within the first 20 minutes. Mrs. Calloway, he said, raising his glass toward Evelyn with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I've been curious to finally meet you. Nathan's kept you rather protected from the rest of us. I didn't realize I needed protecting, Evelyn said easily. No, of course not. Frank's gaze flicked toward Nathan before returning to her. It's just, forgive me for being blunt, but a woman marries a man like Nathan awfully fast for it not to raise a few questions. People wonder what exactly brought the two of you together so quickly. The comment landed exactly where it was meant to, sharp and public enough that 2 other men nearby had drifted closer to listen. Nathan's jaw tightened, and Evelyn felt him shift slightly beside her, ready to step in. She touched his arm lightly, a silent signal that she had this. I understand the question, Evelyn said, her voice calm and steady, carrying just enough for the small crowd to hear. People assume I married Nathan for his money, and I won't pretend the financial terms weren't part of the original conversation. I was drowning in debt after caring for my grandmother for 6 years, and I needed a way out. I've never hidden that. She paused, letting the honesty settle before continuing. But I haven't asked Nathan for a single gift since the wedding. No jewelry, no shopping trips, none of the things people assume a woman in my position would chase after. I didn't marry him to be taken care of. I married him because it solved a problem for both of us at the time, and what's happened since then is something neither of us expected or planned for. Frank raised an eyebrow, clearly unprepared for the directness of it. And what exactly has happened since then? Evelyn glanced at Nathan before answering, something quiet and certain passing between them. I've gotten to know a man most of you have decided you already understand, You see the reputation. I see someone who remembers his employees' children's names, who drove 9 hours instead of flying because it meant more time talking instead of sitting in silence, who spent the last few months trying to prove he's more than the name people are afraid of. She looked back at Frank. I don't need your approval of my marriage, but I won't stand here and let you reduce it to something transactional when it's become considerably more than that. The small crowd around them had gone quiet, several of the men exchanging glances that suggested they hadn't expected a straightforward answer, let alone one delivered without defensiveness or apology. Nathan stepped forward before Frank could respond, setting his own drink down with a deliberate calm. I've known most of you for years, he said, addressing the small gathering rather than Frank specifically. You've watched me build this company since I took over, and most of you have spent that time waiting for me to make a mistake worth talking about. I understand why. It's easier to underestimate someone than to actually know them. He turned to Evelyn, and something in his expression softened in a way few people in that room had ever witnessed. My wife just said more honest things in 30 seconds than most of you have said to me in years. She's never once treated me like the businessman you all see in meetings. She treats me like an ordinary person, which is something I didn't realize I'd missed until she gave it to me. He looked back at Frank. So no, Frank, the marriage isn't soft. It's the first genuinely honest thing in my life that hasn't come with strings attached to profit. The silence that followed felt heavier than any negotiation Nathan had ever conducted in that hotel. Frank, visibly caught off guard, muttered something about needing another drink and excused himself, and the small crowd slowly dispersed, several of them offering Evelyn quiet, respectful nods on their way past. Later that night, walking back to their room along a quiet hallway overlooking the mountains, Evelyn finally let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding all evening. That was terrifying, she admitted. You didn't look terrified. I've gotten good at hiding it. She glanced at him. You didn't have to say all that back there, you know, about me treating you like an ordinary person. I meant every word of it. Nathan stopped walking, turning to face her fully. Nobody's ever defended me the way you just did in there and expected nothing in return for it. I don't know how to thank you for that properly. You just did, Evelyn said softly. They stood there a moment longer, the mountain air cool through the hallway windows, something unspoken settling more firmly between them than it had at any point since the courthouse. Whatever the contract had promised on paper, it hadn't accounted for this, for trust built in a hotel hallway after surviving a room full of people determined to tear it apart. Neither of them mentioned the calendar counting down toward the end of the year. For the first time, neither of them wanted to. 10 months into the marriage, Evelyn flew back to Portland alone. Her grandmother's house had sat empty since the funeral, a small blue bungalow with a garden gone wild and a for sale sign that had been in the yard for months without a single serious offer. The realtor had called twice, asking Evelyn to finish clearing out the last of the belongings before the next round of showings, and she'd put it off as long as she reasonably could. She told Nathan she'd be gone 3 days. He nodded, said something about handling things at the office, and didn't ask to come. She told herself that was fine. It made sense. This wasn't his family, his grief, his mess to sort through. The house felt smaller than she remembered, every room holding some version of her grandmother still. The chipped mug she always used for tea, the reading glasses left on the side table like she might walk back in and need them, the hallway closet still full of coats from decades she'd never worn but never let go of either. Evelyn spent the first day just sitting in the living room, unable to make herself start. She was 3 boxes into the kitchen cabinets the next morning when a car pulled into the driveway she didn't recognize. Nathan stepped out of it, dressed down in a way she'd rarely seen him, jeans and a plain jacket instead of his usual suit, looking almost like a different person outside the context of Chicago's boardrooms. You said you'd handle the office, Evelyn said, standing in the doorway, too surprised to fully process what she was seeing. I did, this morning. Then I got on a flight. Nathan glanced past her into the house. You said 3 days like it was nothing, but you sounded like it was everything. I figured you shouldn't do this part alone. She didn't know what to say to that, so she just stepped aside and let him in. They spent the rest of that day working through the house together, and it turned into something neither of them expected. Not the sad, exhausting task Evelyn had been dreading, but something closer to gentle. Nathan carried boxes without being asked. He found an old photo album in the hall closet and sat on the floor with Evelyn for over an hour, letting her narrate every picture, every story attached to a face he'd never met, but was slowly starting to understand through her memories of them.
"This was her at my college graduation," Evelyn said, pointing to a photo of an older woman beaming beside a much younger version of herself. "She drove 6 hours in a car with no air conditioning because she refused to fly, said planes were for people who didn't value the journey."
She sounds like she had opinions about everything.
"She absolutely did." Evelyn traced the edge of the photo with her thumb. "I miss arguing with her about the stupidest things. I'd give anything for one more disagreement about whether I was eating enough vegetables."
Nathan didn't offer empty comfort. He just sat with her in the quiet after that, letting the moment exist without trying to fix it. And Evelyn found herself grateful for exactly that kind of presence, more than any words he could have offered instead. By the second afternoon, they'd sorted the house into 3 categories: donate, keep, and the small pile of things too personal to part with yet. A local charity came to collect the furniture, and watching strangers carry her grandmother's kitchen table out the front door hit Evelyn harder than she expected. Nathan noticed her go quiet, and without a word, took her hand and simply stood beside her until the truck pulled away.
"Thank you,"
she said quietly,
"for being here. You didn't have to fly out for this."
"I wanted to." Nathan looked at her directly. "I keep trying to figure out when exactly this stopped being an arrangement I was fulfilling and started being a life I actually wanted. I still can't pinpoint the moment, but standing here, watching you say goodbye to this place, I know I don't want to imagine you doing something like this without me next to you." The words hung between them, quiet and unplanned, more honest than either of them had allowed themselves to be since Denver.
"Nathan, I know the contract has 2 months left," he said before she could finish. "I know what we agreed to. I'm not trying to pressure you into anything you don't want. I just needed you to know where I stand, whatever you decide when the year is up." Evelyn felt something tighten in her chest, equal parts hope and fear. She'd spent weeks quietly arriving at the same conclusion herself, turning it over at night, testing whether it was real or just the product of proximity and gratitude. She wanted to stay. She'd known it for a while now, somewhere around the mountain hallway in Denver if she was honest with herself, but admitting it first felt like handing him something she couldn't take back if she was wrong about what he meant. "I need to finish this house," she said instead, gesturing at the boxes still left to sort. "Can we talk about the rest when we're back in Chicago?" Nathan nodded, not pushing further, though something in his expression suggested he'd heard the fear underneath her deflection and understood it better than she expected. They finished the house together over the following day, working in a comfortable quiet that said more than either of them had managed with words. By the time they locked the door behind them for the last time, the small blue bungalow stripped down to its bones and ready for new owners, Evelyn felt the weight of an ending and the fragile shape of a beginning existing in the same breath. On the flight back to Chicago, Nathan fell asleep somewhere over Nebraska, his head resting against the window, and Evelyn watched him for a long while before finally closing her own eyes. 2 months left on the contract, and for the first time since the courthouse, neither of them wanted to reach the end of it. The final day of the contract arrived on a Tuesday, ordinary in every way except for what it was supposed to mean. Marcus Webb showed up at the estate at 10 in the morning with a leather folder under his arm, the same kind of folder he'd carried into Nathan's office the day this entire arrangement began. He set it on the kitchen island, where Evelyn had once cooked chicken and dumplings at midnight, and opened it to reveal a neat stack of paperwork with tabs marking every place that needed a signature. "Everything's in order," Marcus said, glancing between Nathan and Evelyn with the careful neutrality of a man who'd watched this entire year unfold from the outside without ever fully understanding what he'd witnessed. "The settlement's finalized, exactly as agreed. Once you both sign, the marriage dissolves cleanly.
No complications, no delays. Evelyn stared at the papers without touching them.
Since Portland, she and Nathan had circled the subject carefully, both of them aware something had shifted permanently, but neither willing to be the one who said it first and risked being wrong. The 2 months had passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Dinners together that felt increasingly like a real marriage. Mornings where Nathan lingered at the kitchen island instead of rushing to the office. Small moments that made the idea of signing this paperwork feel like a betrayal of everything they built without meaning to. "Give us a minute, Marcus," Nathan said quietly. Marcus hesitated, then nodded, stepping out onto the back terrace and closing the door behind him. The kitchen went silent, except for the sound of the clock above the stove, the same clock that had ticked through countless mornings over the past year. Evelyn wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm spring light coming through the windows. "I keep thinking about the day you moved in," Nathan said finally, breaking the silence. "You stood on that driveway with 2 suitcases and a box of your grandmother's photos, and I remember thinking you'd probably last a month before the reality of this house, this family, this reputation drove you out."
"I remember being terrified you were right," Evelyn admitted.
"You weren't just right to stay. You changed everything about what staying meant." Nathan moved closer, leaning against the counter across from her.
"This contract stopped feeling real to me a long time ago, Evelyn. I couldn't tell you exactly when. Maybe Lake Geneva, maybe Nashville, maybe watching you say goodbye to your grandmother's kitchen table in Portland. But somewhere along the way, I stopped counting down to the end of this and started dreading it instead." Evelyn felt her throat tighten. "Nathan, let me finish," he said gently. "I spent my whole life being told that people only wanted access to what I could give them, not who I actually was underneath it. My grandfather taught me that lesson so thoroughly, I stopped expecting anything different. Then you walked into my life through an arrangement that was never supposed to mean anything, and you gave me the first honest year I can remember having. You laughed in this cold house until it stopped being cold. You defended me in Denver without being asked to. You let me stand beside you in Portland without once making me feel like an intruder in your grief." He reached for the folder Marcus had left on the counter and, without breaking eye contact with her, closed it.
"I don't want to sign this," he said. "Not because the contract requires it, because I don't want you to leave, and I'm done pretending that has anything to do with the terms we agreed to a year ago." Evelyn felt tears gathering before she could stop them, a mixture of relief and fear and something warmer than either.
"I've been so scared to say this first," she admitted. "I kept telling myself it was gratitude or comfort or just the strange bond people build living under the same roof for a year. I didn't want to hand you something you might not want back."
"I want it back," Nathan said immediately. "All of it."
"When I signed that contract, I thought I was agreeing to survive a year of my life and come out the other side with enough money to start over."
Evelyn wiped at her eyes, laughing softly despite herself.
"I never expected to fall in love with the man everyone warned me about. I never expected him to turn out to be nothing like the rumors."
"And now?"
"Now, I don't recognize the version of you people whisper about in boardrooms. I know the man who drove 9 hours because flying meant less time talking. I know the man who learned every housekeeper's name because I asked him to pay attention. I know the man who flew across the country without being asked, just so I wouldn't grieve alone." She looked up at him, steadier now. "I don't see the man everyone warned me about anymore, Nathan. I haven't for a long time." Nathan crossed the last of the distance between them, reaching for her hands, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. The weight of an entire year settling into something that finally felt honest instead of arranged. "So what happens now?" Evelyn asked eventually. "The paperwork's sitting right there. Marcus is waiting outside for an answer." "Now we tell him the marriage isn't ending." Nathan glanced toward the terrace door, then back at her, something lighter in his expression than she'd ever seen there before. "Though I think it deserves to start over properly, not as a contract with an expiration date, as something neither of us has to prove or defend or explain to anyone else ever again." Evelyn felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for months, maybe longer. That sounds like exactly what I want. Outside, Marcus glanced through the window and, seeing the two of them standing close together instead of reaching for the paperwork, allowed himself a small, knowing smile before deciding to give them a few more minutes of privacy. Inside, the folder stayed closed on the counter, forgotten, while Nathan and Evelyn stood in the kitchen that had once felt like the coldest room in a cold house, now finally warm enough to call it home. 3 weeks after the day the contract was supposed to end, Nathan told Evelyn to pack a bag again, the same words he'd used before Lake Geneva almost a year earlier. "Business?" she asked, half joking, folding a sweater into her suitcase. "No business this time." Nathan leaned against the doorframe, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Just somewhere I want to take you. No hotels to inspect, no contracts to negotiate. Just us." They flew to northern Michigan and took a ferry the rest of the way to Mackinac Island, a place with no cars allowed, where the only sounds were horse-drawn carriages, bicycle bells, and water lapping against the docks. Evelyn had never been anywhere like it. No traffic, no skyline, just old Victorian buildings, fudge shops lining Main Street, and a wide, endless view of Lake Huron stretching toward the horizon. "This place doesn't feel real," she said, standing at the porch railing of the old inn Nathan had booked, watching the sun begin to set over the water. "My grandfather brought me here once, a long time ago, before the business consumed everything else about him." Nathan came to stand beside her. "It's the only good memory I have of him that doesn't come tangled up with pressure or expectation. I wanted to bring you somewhere that felt like a beginning instead of a boardroom." Evelyn smiled, leaning into him slightly. "It's beautiful." "It's not the only reason I brought you here." Something in his tone made her turn to look at him fully. Nathan reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the edges like it had been carried around for weeks. He unfolded it slowly, and Evelyn recognized it immediately. The divorce paperwork from Marcus's folder, the one that had sat closed and forgotten on the kitchen island months earlier. "I kept this," Nathan admitted, "not because I ever intended to sign it. I kept it because I wanted to be the one to end it properly, on my own terms, somewhere that actually meant something." He tore it in half, then in half again, and let the pieces fall into a small wooden box he'd brought along, closing the lid like he was sealing away the last remnant of an arrangement that had never truly defined what they'd become. "That contract asked you to stay for a year because you had no other choice," Nathan said, taking both her hands in his. "I'm not asking you to stay because of debt or convenience or a will that threatened to take everything from me if I didn't marry someone. I'm asking you to choose me again, completely free this time, with no deadline and no obligation attached to it. If the answer is no, nothing about how I feel toward you changes. But if the answer is yes, I want to build something real with you, starting today." He got down on one knee, right there on the porch overlooking the lake, and Evelyn felt her breath catch, the moment landing somewhere between overwhelming and inevitable. "Evelyn Harper," he said, "will you marry me? Not the man everyone in Chicago whispers about, just me, however that turns out to look." "Yes," she said, before he'd even finished the question fully, laughing through the tears gathering in her eyes. "Yes, obviously yes." He stood and pulled her into him, and for a long moment neither of them said anything else, the sound of the lake and the distant clatter of a passing carriage the only things filling the space around them. They married 2 weeks later, back on the island, in a small ceremony on the lakeside lawn behind the inn. There was no press, no business associates angling for photographs, none of the calculated appearances that had defined their first wedding. Renata came, along with Otis and Priya and several others from the estate who'd watched the marriage grow into something real over the past year. Evelyn's college roommate flew in from Portland.
A few of Nathan's employees who'd become genuine friends over the months stood among the small crowd, along with a handful of Nathan's extended family who'd quietly supported the relationship once they saw how much lighter he seemed whenever Evelyn was near him. Evelyn wore a simple dress, nothing like the clearance rack ivory from the courthouse, but no more elaborate either, something that felt like her, comfortable and unpretentious, exactly the way she'd always been. Nathan stood at the end of the aisle, without the guarded posture that used to define every public appearance, watching her walk toward him with an openness few people in his life had ever witnessed. The ceremony was short, the vows simple and unrehearsed. When the officiant pronounced them married for the second time in just over a year, Nathan kissed Evelyn without hesitation, without an audience of business rivals evaluating the performance, without anything transactional shadowing the moment at all. That evening, as the small gathering wound down and the sun dropped below the water, Evelyn stood at the same port railing where Nathan had proposed, watching guests drift toward the docks for the evening ferry, feeling a kind of peace she hadn't known existed a year earlier, when she'd walked into a coffee shop to meet a stranger she'd agreed to marry for money. Nathan found her there, slipping an arm around her waist. "Regrets?" he asked, only half serious. "About marrying the most feared man in Chicago twice in 1 year?" Evelyn leaned her head against his shoulder. "Not a single one." They flew back to Chicago the next morning, and the estate that had once felt like the coldest house in the city welcomed them home, with warm light spilling from every window, staff waiting with genuine smiles instead of practiced courtesy, and a life ahead of them built on something no contract had ever promised. No longer strangers playing roles for appearances, no longer counting down toward an ending neither of them wanted, Nathan and Evelyn began a marriage rooted in the very thing the arrangement was never supposed to allow, something entirely, unmistakably real.